Boots. Sit down and don't move. We have a situation with you. The words landed in first class like a drop tray of glasses. Boots. A man in seat 3A lowered his newspaper an inch. A flight attendant pouring orange juice froze mid-tilt, the liquid climbing the rim of the cup before she caught it. Boots. Somewhere near the galley, the soft jazz piped through the cabin speakers, kept playing, oblivious, cheerful, completely wrong. For the moment it was soundtracking. Boots. Elijah Turner did not move first. He looked up. He was 51 years old, sitting in seat 2A, wearing a navy fleece pullover with a small frayed hole at the left cuff, jeans and scuffed brown boots that had never once been polished for an occasion. Boots. Nothing about him said money. Nothing about him said power. His boarding pass sat folded under his coffee cup, and the book on his tray table, a worn paperback about the history of American railroads, was open to page 40, a receipt from a gas station in Independence, Missouri, tucked in as a bookmark. Boots. Two people stood over him. A woman in a crisp gray blazer with gold wings pinned above her name badge, Deborah Pratt, senior cabin manager, and behind her, a broad-shouldered gate security officer whose hand rested on his belt radio like he was bracing for something. Boots. Is there a problem? Elijah asked. His voice was even. Not loud, not soft either. We've received a concern, Deborah said. Boots. About your presence in this cabin. What kind of concern? That's not something I'm able to discuss with you right now. Boots. Her tone had the practiced smoothness of someone who had said a version of that sentence many times before, and never once had it questioned back to her. Boots. I need you to gather your things and come with us. Elijah looked around the cabin. A woman 2 rows up had her phone lowered into her lap, thumb hovering, not filming, just holding it because her hands needed somewhere to be. Boots. Across the aisle, a man in a charcoal suit suddenly discovered something fascinating about his own shoelaces. Nobody spoke. Nobody looked directly at him. Boots. That silence, not the announcement, not the badge, not even the request itself, was the part that would stay lodged in his chest longest, the part he would still be turning over 3 days later at 2 in the morning, unable to sleep. Boots. He closed his laptop. Slowly, deliberately, as if he had all the time on earth, though something inside him had already gone cold and still, the way a lake goes still right before a storm crosses it. Boots. He had learned a long time ago, from a man who never once raised his voice in 40 years of factory work, that there is a kind of dignity that lives entirely in what you refuse to give people. Boots. Not your anger, not your fear, just your calm handed back to them like a mirror. Lead the way, he said and stood. Boots. He heard it before he'd taken 3 steps. A voice, pitched low but not low enough, dripping with a satisfaction that didn't even try to hide itself. Boots. I told you something felt wrong about him. He didn't need to turn to know where it came from. He turned anyway. Boots. Seat 3C. A woman in her late 40s, cream cashmere sweater, a stack of thin gold bracelets that clinked faintly as she adjusted her sunglasses on top of her head, like she was settling in to watch a show. Boots. Vivian Sorrell dropped her eyes the instant his met hers. Too late. He had already seen it, the certainty on her face. Boots. The complete, comfortable absence of doubt. He walked forward, past the flight attendant whose smile didn't reach anywhere near her eyes. Boots. Past rows that suddenly felt narrower than they had 10 minutes earlier, the aisle somehow tighter, the air somehow thinner. Boots. When he crossed the threshold of the aircraft door, the cold jet bridge air hit his face, and something in him shifted along with it. Boots. He was no longer a passenger. He was a problem to be solved. 4 hours earlier, Elijah Turner had been standing barefoot on the cold kitchen tile of a modest 2-bedroom rental in Overland Park, Kansas, 12 minutes from the airport, in a building with no doorman and no name carved over the entrance. Boots. It was the kind of apartment nobody would guess belonged to a man 48 hours from closing the largest infrastructure deal of his career. Boots. He liked it plain. He always had. A silver 2019 Honda Accord sat in the parking garage downstairs, instead of anything that turned heads on the highway. Boots. On his left wrist, he wore a watch that had belonged to his father, the crystal scratched in a spidering pattern across the 6, the brown leather band cracked and dark with age at the buckle hole he used most. Boots. Worth maybe $35 if you tried to sell it. Worth every single thing he owned if you understood what it meant. Boots. Samuel Turner had worn that watch for 33 years, tightening bolts on regional aircraft engines at a small municipal airport outside Flint, Michigan, coming home every evening smelling like grease and jet fuel, dinner gone cold on the stove more nights than not because overtime paid the light bill and pride didn't. Boots. Samuel Turner had fixed the engines on hundreds of planes in his life. He had flown on exactly one of them, the year before he died, when Elijah bought him a first-class ticket to Phoenix and watched a 68-year-old man press his forehead to the window for the entire flight like a boy seeing snowfall for the first time. Boots. That was the thing the woman in 3C would never understand, not in 100 years of thinking about it. Boots. Elijah hadn't built Halbrook Meridian Capital to prove anything to people like her. He'd built it because his father used to say, quiet as an apology, not bitter, just tired. Some men get the front of the plane, and some men just fix the engines. Boots. And Elijah had spent 24 years trying to make that sentence stop being true for somebody else's son. Boots. Today, he was flying from Kansas City to Nashville, Tennessee, to close a $4.8 billion investment in Coastal Vista Airlines, a deal that would rebuild their aging regional fleet, restructure their ground operations, and buried quietly in Section 11 of a 180-page agreement that nobody in the boardroom had thought twice about. Fund a permanent independent office to review how the airline treated the people who flew with it and the people who worked for it. Boots. Elijah still remembered the exact sentence his father had said the week before he died, sitting on the edge of a hospital bed with an oxygen line taped under his nose, watching his son straighten his father's own watch on a nightstand. Boots. Don't you dare buy me a new one, Samuel had said, half a laugh caught somewhere in his chest. That one's earned its scratches. Boots. Elijah had worn it every day since. Not as a memorial, as a compass. Whenever a room started treating him like his money was the only interesting thing about him, he'd glance down at that cracked crystal and remember a man who had never once needed anyone's permission to be worth something. Boots. Nobody on Flight 227 knew any of that. They just saw a quiet man in a fleece pullover, sitting in first class, and Deborah Pratt had already decided, somewhere between the boarding chime and the safety demonstration, that he didn't belong there. Boots. Remember that pullover. It is going to matter again before this story is finished. And remember the watch, too. It never leaves his wrist, not once, from the first page of this story to the last. Boots. Deborah Pratt had been flying for 19 years. Boots. She had trained under 2 different airline names as smaller regional carriers folded into Coastal Vista, one after another, survived a round of pandemic layoffs that cut her department by 40% and clawed her way into the senior cabin manager position through nothing but seniority and an unshakable belief that she, and only she, understood what standards actually meant. Boots. By every official measurement, she was excellent at her job. She remembered names. She had once talked a panicking passenger down from a full-blown attack over the Rockies, using nothing but a paper bag and a steady voice. Boots. Her performance reviews, 5 years running, used the word exemplary. She was also, quietly and consistently, the flight attendant who had filed more identity verification concerns against Black and Latino passengers seated in first class than any other crew member in the airline's central division. Boots. A pattern nobody had ever pulled up, because nobody had ever been told to look for one. Boots. 11 minutes into boarding, Vivian Sorrell had leaned toward Deborah during the safety briefing and murmured 6 words that would end up costing more people their jobs, their reputations, and, in one case, their entire way of understanding themselves than either of them could have imagined that morning. Boots. That man doesn't look like he belongs. Deborah hadn't asked what she meant. She hadn't needed to. She simply nodded the way you nod at something you already believed before anyone bothered to say it out loud, and she radioed the gate. Boots. That was Tier 1. Quiet, deniable, the kind of thing that if questioned could be waved away later as an abundance of caution. Boots. Nobody raises their voice at this stage. Nobody has to. On the jet bridge, the air was louder, less controlled. Boots. A baggage cart rattled somewhere down the corridor below. The security officer, his badge read T. Reed, pulled out a small notepad, his pen already uncapped. Boots. Full name. Elijah Turner. Purpose of travel? Business. What kind of business? Elijah shifted his weight, watching Reed now, really watching him, the way you watch a man deciding whether to keep walking down a road he already half suspects is wrong. Boots. A meeting, he said. With who? A pause, not long, long enough, with your airline's board of directors. Tomorrow morning 9 a. Boots. Their headquarters on Broadway in Nashville. Reed blinked. Deborah, standing just behind him, crossed her arms. And what's your role in that meeting? Boots, she asked, her voice sharpening, the way voices sharpen when the ground underneath them has started, very quietly, to shift. Boots. Elijah held her eyes a beat longer than was comfortable for either of them. I'm the one funding it. The jet bridge went quiet in a different way than the cabin had. Boots. Not respectful. Not yet. Uncertain. The particular silence that arrives right before somebody realizes the floor beneath them isn't nearly as solid as they believed 30 seconds earlier. Boots. Do you have anything that confirms that? Deborah asked, and there was still an edge in it. Still that stubborn refusal to be the one standing there wrong. Boots. Elijah reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his phone, and turned the screen toward her. An email thread. Names. Boots. Titles, a dollar figure with 10 digits before the decimal point. Investment Committee. Final terms. 4,800,000,000. Signature pending. Boots. Reed leaned in and read faster than he meant to. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. Somewhere behind them a luggage cart rolled past, the ordinary noise of an airport terminal moving forward, indifferent to the fact that something in this small corner of it had just cracked wide open. Boots. Deborah's jaw tightened. Well, she said finally, each word coming out like it cost her something physical to produce. It looks like everything checks out. Boots.
Checks out.
Elijah repeated. He didn't smile. He didn't push. He just stood there waiting, letting the silence do what silence does better than any accusation ever could. Boots. You're free to return to your seat, sir, Reed said. Sir, the word had changed shape in 90 seconds flat. Boots. It hadn't earned that shift through respect. It had earned it through fear, and Elijah knew the difference, the way you know, the difference between sunlight and a flashlight pointed in your face. Boots. He had already turned to walk back up the jet bridge when Deborah spoke again, and this time her voice had a different edge to it. Not uncertainty. Boots. Something closer to panic dressed up as procedure. I'll still need to log this properly, she said. Standard policy requires a secondary bag check whenever a verification concern has been raised. Boots. She said it fast, the way people talk when they're building a wall out of paperwork, because they can feel the ground moving under the first one. Boots. Reed hesitated. Deborah, he showed us. Secondary bag check, she repeated, louder this time, loud enough that a family waiting at the adjacent gate turned to look. Boots. It's procedure. There was no such procedure. Elijah knew it. Reed, from the flicker across his face, seemed to know it too. Boots. But 19 years of institutional weight sat behind Deborah's voice, and Reed was 26 years old and 2 years into the job, and so he unzipped the carry-on anyway, laid it open on a stainless steel inspection table bolted to the jet bridge wall, and began removing items one at a time in front of a small and growing audience of strangers. Boots. A folded shirt, a phone charger, the paperback about American railroads, its spine cracking slightly as it fell open to page 40. Boots. A father waiting nearby pulled his son a half-step closer, the universal unconscious gesture of a parent deciding, without quite admitting it to himself, that what's happening here was not safe to stand too near. Boots. Elijah didn't move, didn't reach for the bag, didn't ask her to hurry. Boots. He stood with his hands loosely at his sides and watched a woman he had never met before that morning turn his gas station receipt over in her fingers like it might tell her something, and somewhere behind his ribs a decision finished forming, cold and complete. This was no longer going to be a story he simply let happen to him. Boots. It was Renata Cole, 3 days later, reading Reed's own incident notes aloud in a conference room, who would put a name to what had just occurred on that jet bridge. Boots. There is no bag check policy triggered by a verification concern, she said, tapping the page. There has never been one. Boots. She invented it in real time because she needed 30 more seconds to find something, anything, that would let her be right. Boots. Nobody in that room said a word for a long time after that. If you think that's the end of it, keep listening, because Deborah Pratt was not a woman who apologized easily, and the next 18 hours were about to prove exactly how far she would go to avoid admitting, in front of a plane full of witnesses, that she'd been wrong. Boots. He walked back down the jet bridge with no rush in his step. At the cabin door, a young flight attendant. Her tag read N. Boots. Voss stepped aside too quickly. "Welcome back," she said, thin, careful. He didn't answer. He walked in. Heads lifted again, not as openly this time, but they lifted. Boots. A man in the aisle suddenly found something fascinating in his own seat-back pocket. A woman by the window pressed her lips into a flat line and stared straight ahead. Boots. Row 3C, Vivian Sorrell did not look up. Her hand gripped her coffee cup so tightly the plastic lid bent under her fingers, a thin line of liquid trembling at the seam, threatening to spill and never quite doing it. Boots. Elijah paused beside his seat for half a second, not to embarrass her, not to confront her, just to exist there fully, in the space she had decided he didn't belong in. Boots. Then he sat, opened his laptop, same movements as before, nothing about them felt the same. The cabin doors sealed with a dull, final click. Boots. The captain's voice came over the speaker, calm and completely unaware, like nothing at all had happened 30 feet from the cockpit. Boots. We'll be pushing back shortly, folks. Sit back and relax. Elijah did not sit back. He opened a blank document while the memory was still sharp. Time of boarding, names, exact words, who looked away and who didn't. Boots. 24 years of closing deals with men who thought they could talk their way around a paper trail had taught him one unbreakable rule. Memory fades. Boots. Documents don't. Then he opened his email and typed one name from memory. Renata Cole, General Counsel, Coastal Vista Airlines. Boots. His thumb hovered a moment before he began. Removed from aircraft prior to departure. No explanation provided. Reinstated only after I produced financial documentation confirming my business relationship with your company. Boots. This is not, I suspect, an isolated incident. This is a pattern your airline has failed to see. He sent it before the wheels had even begun to roll. Boots. The plane picked up speed, the runway sliding by outside the window in long gray blurred lines. Elijah reached for the water the young attendant had brought. No ice. Boots. Her hand lingered a half-second too long as she set it down. "I'm sorry," she said, barely above a whisper. Boots. For earlier, he looked at her, really looked. There was something new there, not fear exactly. Awareness. He nodded once, not forgiving, not condemning, just acknowledging that she'd said the words out loud, which was more than most people in that cabin had managed. Boots. She stepped away toward the galley, shoulders tight. Across the aisle, a man in a gray suit leaned toward him. Boots. Late 60s, a wedding band worn thin from decades of wear, hands marked by real labor. "I owe you an apology," he said. Boots. I sat here and watched. I knew it felt wrong. I didn't say a word. "You don't owe me anything," Elijah said. Boots. "I do." The man's voice wavered. "I should have spoken up." "Yes," Elijah said simply. "You should have." The man nodded, absorbing it without flinching. Boots. "I will next time." Elijah believed him. Not because the promise was dramatic, but because it had cost the man something to say it out loud, unprompted, in front of strangers. Boots. The runway stretched wide and empty ahead of them. Elijah scrolled to a contact he hadn't planned on calling until the following morning. Boots. Gerald Whitfield, Chief Executive Officer, Coastal Vista Airlines. His thumb pressed the call button before he'd fully decided to do it. Boots. 2 rings, then a voice. Confident, unaware. "Looking forward to tomorrow. We need to talk," Elijah said, and this time there was no pause on his end at all. Boots. Whitfield didn't speak for several seconds after Elijah finished. When he did, his voice had lost every trace of its polish. Boots. Removed? For what reason? That's the question I'm hoping your airline can answer. Were you touched, detained, anything physical? No. Boots. Whitfield exhaled slowly. That almost makes it worse. "It does," Elijah said, "because people will call it a misunderstanding and expect me to move on from it by dinner." Boots. The plane lifted off the runway. Outside the window, Kansas City fell away beneath the wing, streets shrinking into a grid of tiny gray geometry. Boots. Whitfield went quiet. The kind of quiet that belongs to a man doing math in his head. Math that involves lawsuits, headlines, and a $4.8 billion deal that could still fall apart before the ink dried. Boots. "I want a full written report the moment you land," Whitfield said, finally. "Every name, every word. You'll have it." Boots. Elijah. "I'm sorry, this time it didn't sound rehearsed. It sounded like a man realizing, in real time, exactly how deep a hole his company had just dug for itself." Boots. "I know," Elijah said, and ended the call. "But here is the part you need to understand before we go any further, because it is the part that makes everything after it so much worse than a single bad flight." Boots. This was not the first time Deborah Pratt had done this. It wasn't even the 5th. And by the time the plane touched down in Nashville, the woman in 3C had already tried, twice, to catch a flight attendant's eye, and failed both times. Boots. When Nadia Voss finally passed her row again, Vivian leaned forward. "Excuse me, I think I may have caused all of this." Boots. The attendant stopped walking. "I told someone he didn't seem like he belonged." Vivian's voice had lost every bit of its earlier certainty. Boots. "I wasn't trying to get anyone thrown off a plane, I understand," Nadia said carefully. "No." Vivian stared at the tray table in front of her. Boots. "I don't think you do. My father taught me to judge people by how they treat others. Somewhere along the way, I stopped doing that." Boots. Nadia didn't know what to say. Neither did anyone close enough to overhear. She walked back toward the galley, where an older attendant caught the look on her face. Boots. "You okay?" "Not really," Nadia said. "We followed a complaint. We never once asked whether the complaint made any sense." Boots. "We just trusted the assumption." "Yeah," the older woman said. Neither of them said anything else. The realization sat there in the small galley between them like something heavy that had just been set down and could never quite be picked back up the same way again. Boots. 2 rows behind Vivian, a mother traveling alone with a 6-year-old had watched the entire jet bridge scene through the window before boarding. The open bag, the receipt turned over in a stranger's fingers, a man standing still while his privacy was picked apart in front of an audience. Boots. She had almost said something to the gate agent then. Her hand had actually come up, one finger half raised, the beginning of a sentence forming in her throat. Boots. And then she thought about the flight, about her son, about the 7-hour layover already ahead of them if she got pulled into anything, and she lowered her hand and boarded the plane instead. Boots. She would think about that lowered hand for a long time afterward, long after she had forgotten the gate number, the flight number, even the year. Boots. Some silences cost the people who choose them more than they ever admit out loud. Here's the part almost nobody in that cabin saw coming. Boots. The woman who whispered 6 careless words was about to spend the next several days watching her name get pulled apart in a boardroom she never imagined she'd sit in. Boots. And the manager who had never once doubted herself in 19 years was about to learn that a career built on quiet certainty can end in the time it takes to read a single spreadsheet out loud. Boots. The next morning at 8:52, Elijah walked into Coastal Vista's headquarters on Broadway in downtown Nashville. A 19-story glass tower with the airline's Silver Falcon logo mounted 40 feet above the entrance, catching the early sun so hard it looked lit from inside. Boots. Gerald Whitfield met him in the lobby personally, no assistant trailing behind, no press waiting outside. Just the CEO alone, looking like a man who hadn't slept. Boots. "I pulled the internal complaint logs last night," Whitfield said as they walked toward the elevator. "I need you to see something before we go upstairs." Boots. On the 14th floor, in a small glass-walled conference room, Renata Cole, general counsel, sharp gray suit, reading glasses pushed up into short-cropped hair, had already laid out a folder 3 inches thick on the table. Boots. She didn't waste time on pleasantries. Deborah Pratt has filed 22 identity verification concerns in the last 5 years, Renata said. Boots. 17 of them involved Black or Latino passengers, seated in first or business class. 14 of the 17 were closed with a written apology and a travel voucher. Boots. Nobody ever pulled the pattern, because nobody was ever told to look for one. Whitfield sat down slowly, like the weight of the number had physically pushed him into the chair. Boots. 17 out of 22. "There's more," Renata said. 3 of those passengers filed formal complaints with the Department of Transportation. Boots. All 3 were closed internally as unsubstantiated, by Deborah's own direct supervisor, who happens to be her sister's father-in-law. Boots. The room went still in the particular way a room goes still when everyone in it understands, at the exact same moment, that they are no longer looking at one bad morning. Boots. They are looking at a system that has been quietly protecting itself for years. Whitfield rubbed a hand across his face. Boots. How did none of us catch this? Because nobody was ever asked to look, Renata said again, more quietly this time, like she was answering herself as much as him. Boots. That's not an accident. That's a design. Every one of those 17 cases got closed with an apology and a voucher instead of a question, because a voucher is cheaper than an investigation, and an investigation is cheaper than admitting there might be a pattern at all. Boots. It's not that the system failed. The system worked exactly the way it was built to work. It just wasn't built to protect the right people. Boots. "What do you want to do?" Whitfield asked, looking at Elijah. Elijah opened the folder, scanning names, dates, the dollar amounts of vouchers that had been used to make 17 separate incidents disappear without ever changing a single thing about how they happened. Boots. "I'm not interested in one manager losing her badge and everybody calling it justice," he said. "I want every one of those 17 passengers found." Boots. "I want them told the truth about what actually happened to their complaints. And I want an independent audit of every crew member's file across this entire airline, going back 7 years." Boots. Renata Cole nodded slowly. "That's going to cost you time on the closing. Then it costs me time," Elijah said. Boots. "Stay with this next part, because it is the ugliest turn the story takes, and you will want to know exactly how far it went before you find out how it ended." Boots. The audit took 19 days. Elijah flew back to Kansas City twice during that stretch, and both times reporters were already camped outside his office building, tipped off by someone inside Coastal Vista who couldn't stay quiet about what the investigators were finding. Boots. He gave no interviews. He let the paper trail speak for itself. What it said turned out to be far worse than anyone in that 14th floor conference room had expected. Boots. Deborah Pratt had not acted alone, and she had not acted rarely. The audit uncovered a shared spreadsheet, informally passed between 4 senior crew members over 6 years, that flagged passengers by seat number with a single column labeled simply check. Boots. Nobody had ever written down what the word meant. Nobody had ever needed to. Every flagged passenger across 6 years of entries shared one thing in common, and it wasn't printed on any boarding pass. Boots. There was also an email, sent 2 years earlier, in which Deborah had written to her supervisor after one of the earlier complaints was dismissed. Boots. I stand by my judgment. Some people simply don't carry themselves the way that cabin expects. Her supervisor had replied with a single line, understood. Boots. Keep doing what you're doing. That email became the center of everything that followed. Deborah was called into a formal review 2 weeks after Flight 227. Boots. She sat across from Renata Cole, a labor attorney, and a human resources director. The audit folder closed on the table between them, like a door that hadn't been opened yet, but everyone in the room already knew what was behind it. Boots. She did not apologize, not once in 90 minutes. I was doing my job, she said, arms crossed. If people don't like being asked a few questions, that's not discrimination. Boots. That's procedure. There is no procedure that instructs crew to pull a passenger off an aircraft. Because another passenger said he looked wrong, Renata said, sliding the audit summary across the table. Boots. There's this instead. Deborah glanced at the 17 names listed on the page and didn't flinch. I don't recognize a pattern in doing my job carefully. Boots. You will, Renata said quietly. Before this is finished, she was terminated that afternoon. Not suspended. Not offered a quiet resignation with a severance package and a signature on a non-disclosure agreement. Boots. Terminated with cause. The decision documented in writing, and copied to every regulatory body with jurisdiction to ask why it had taken 7 years and a $4.8 billion investor to catch what should have been obvious the very first time. Boots. Her supervisor, the one who had told her to keep doing what she was doing, was terminated the same week. Boots. Even then, walking out of that 14th floor conference room with a cardboard box of 19 years' worth of laminated commendations and a company badge that no longer opened any door in the building, Deborah stopped at Renata Cole's office doorway and said one last thing, quiet enough that it almost sounded like it was meant only for herself. Boots. I built my whole career on being the person who caught what other people missed. Renata looked up from her desk. Boots. You did, she said. You just never once asked yourself what you were actually catching. Deborah didn't answer that. She simply turned and walked to the elevator, and for the first time in 19 years, nobody in that building called her ma'am on the way out. Boots. The Department of Transportation reopened all 3 closed complaints and launched a formal civil rights investigation into the airline's complaint handling process. Boots. 14 weeks later, that investigation produced a $1.9 million settlement and a 5-year federal consent decree requiring independent oversight of every identity verification incident going forward. Boots. Deborah filed a wrongful termination lawsuit 4 months later. It fell apart in discovery, in front of a courtroom that had already seen the Flight 227 footage, Recorded, it turned out, by the man in the charcoal suit who had looked so interested in his shoelaces, circulated online more than 14 million times. Boots. On the second day of the trial, the airline's attorney read the check spreadsheet into the record, seat number by seat number, name by name, 6 years of entries in a flat, even voice that somehow made it worse than shouting could have. Boots. Deborah sat at the plaintiff's table, with her hands folded so tightly her knuckles had gone pale, staring at a water stain on the ceiling tile above the judge's bench, and for the first time since Flight 227, several people in that courtroom noticed her jaw was trembling. Boots. Her own attorney asked for a recess. She refused it. "Finish it," she said. "I want to hear all of it." Boots. Nobody in the room, including her own legal team, fully understood in that moment whether it was defiance or the beginning of something else. Boots. Her spreadsheet entries were read back to her, line by line, in her own handwriting. She lost. She was ordered to cover the airline's legal costs. Boots. Her flight attendant certification, the thing she had been proudest of in her entire life, was permanently revoked by the FAA following the DOT's findings. Boots. Her husband of 21 years filed for divorce 9 weeks after the trial ended, telling a mutual friend he could no longer recognize the woman who had once cried at their daughter's wedding out of pure, uncomplicated joy. Boots. No airline in the country would touch her name again. Boots. The woman who had spent 19 years quietly deciding who looked like they belonged in first class ended up, 7 months later, working the overnight shift at a rental car counter outside a regional airport in eastern Kentucky, where the biggest decision she made in a day was which customer got the compact and which one got the mid-size. Boots. She did not come to that place easily, and she did not come to it with grace. For months, in every conversation, every deposition, every hallway encounter with a former colleague, she insisted she had done nothing wrong. Boots. It was only in the 8th month, alone in a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat, sorting through a box of old performance reviews that all used the same word, exemplary, that something in her finally broke open. Boots. She sat on the floor of that apartment at 11 at night with the box in her lap, and, for the first time since Flight 227, she let herself actually read the 17 names on the audit report. Boots. Not skim them, read them, say them out loud one at a time to an empty room. She wrote a letter after that. Boots. Not to a lawyer, not to a reporter. To Elijah directly, admitting in her own handwriting exactly what she had said, exactly why she had said it, and exactly what it had cost 17 strangers who had done nothing except sit down in a seat they'd paid for. Boots. She asked for nothing in return except the chance, someday, to make some small part of it right. Elijah never met with her in person. Boots. But he did forward the letter, unedited, to the airline's new head of culture and training, with a single instruction: use it in the bias awareness curriculum, with her name attached, if she consents to it. Boots. She consented. Her own words, read aloud in a training room to new hires 11 months later, became one of the most quoted lines in the entire program. I judged a man in 4 seconds, and it took me 19 days to even start understanding what that cost him. Boots. Vivian Sorrell's story went differently because she chose differently, and far sooner. Within a week of the flight, she had written her own letter, not to protect herself, but because the silence was eating her alive. Boots. She never flew Coastal Vista again without walking up to whichever gate agent was working and saying, "Good morning, my name is Vivian Sorrell," and waiting, patiently, for them to finish whatever they were doing before she said another word. Boots. It was a small ritual. It cost her nothing but a little pride. She kept doing it anyway. The investment committee met 11 days after the audit closed. Boots. Around a long table on the top floor of Holbrook Meridian's Kansas City office sat investors, board members, and senior advisors who had trusted Elijah Turner's judgment for over 2 decades. Boots. They also expected him, always, to keep feeling separate from finance. Marguerite Alvarez, the committee chair, folded her glasses and set them down. Boots. The airline responded faster and more thoroughly than any company I've seen in a situation like this. Termination. Federal disclosure. Boots. A 5-year consent decree they didn't fight. She looked directly at Elijah. The question in front of us is whether we move forward. Boots. The room went quiet, every eye turned to him. This was never about punishment, Elijah said finally. If I wanted revenge, this meeting would already be over, and there wouldn't be a deal left to discuss. Boots. Then what are we deciding? One board member asked. Whether their accountability is real, Elijah said. He set Renata Cole's full report on the table. Boots. I believe it is, but I'm not signing today. Marguerite raised an eyebrow. If you believe they're sincere, why wait? Boots. Because trust is built through actions, not promises, Elijah said. Culture doesn't change in 19 days. It changes one decision at a time, made over and over, long after nobody's watching anymore. Boots. Marguerite wrote a single line in her notebook and underlined it twice. Trust requires evidence. The committee voted unanimously to keep the deal alive on a 90-day observation period. Boots. There were no losers in that room. Only responsibility finally landing where it belonged. 90 days later, Gerald Whitfield called Elijah personally to deliver the news himself. Boots. The Independent Oversight Board just certified every reform, he said. Every single one implemented. They added 4 recommendations we hadn't even thought of. Boots. Did you accept them? All of them. A pause longer than the silence usually allowed between two men who talked business for a living. Boots. I owe you something, Elijah. You don't owe me anything. I do. You reminded me that leadership isn't protecting a company's reputation. Boots. It's protecting the people who trust that reputation in the first place. Neither man spoke for a moment. Some silences carry more weight than any sentence that could follow them. Boots. The $4.8 billion deal closed the following week. Not because Coastal Vista had become a perfect company. No company ever does, but because for 90 straight days, they had chosen accountability over excuses and action over appearances. Boots. The most valuable thing that deal ever produced was never going to show up on a balance sheet. 7 months after Flight 227, Elijah walked back through the same terminal in Kansas City, where it had all started. Boots. No cameras followed him this time. No reporters waited by the gate. To everyone around him, he was just another traveler pulling a scuffed leather carry-on across polished floors, the same scratched watch on his wrist that his father used to wear on the tarmac in Flint decades earlier. Boots. The terminal looked almost unchanged. Same departure boards, same coffee stand near gate C9, but something in the air had shifted in ways most people would never notice unless they were looking for them. Boots. A young gate agent greeted every passenger with the same steady, unhurried smile. An elderly couple wrestling with an oversized suitcase had help before they even asked. Boots. A wheelchair attendant waited patiently beside a nervous teenager traveling alone, chatting with her gently until her family found the gate. Boots. Small things, easy to miss. Elijah noticed every one of them, because real culture is rarely built through a headline. Boots. It's built through 100 ordinary decisions, repeated on 100 ordinary mornings, by people who will never see their names in any report. Boots. As he approached security, someone called his name. Mr. Turner, he turned. It was Tobias Reed, the young security officer from that first morning. Boots. Older somehow, though it hadn't been long. Not in age. In something else. I wasn't sure you'd remember me, Reed said. Boots. I remember. Reed took a slow breath. I wanted to thank you. You could have asked for my job. You didn't. Boots. Instead, you asked the airline to help me get better at mine. He hesitated. My daughter asked me last week why I started volunteering at the community center on Saturdays. Boots. I told her someone reminded me that wearing a badge doesn't automatically make you right. It just gives you the chance to do right. Boots. Neither man spoke for a moment. Then Elijah extended his hand. Reed shook it firm, no bitterness left in it at all. Boots. Further down the concourse, Nadia Voss approached, wearing a different pin on her uniform now, Training Lead stitched beneath her name. Boots. I thought that was you, she said, smiling. You look well. I am, Elijah said. How's the new role? I've been leading new hire orientation, she said, pulling a worn notebook from her bag. Boots. She opened it to the first page. One line, underlined twice. Following procedure will never excuse abandoning humanity. We read it together every Monday. Boots. Then something good came out of a difficult morning, Elijah said. It did, she said. When boarding began, an elderly veteran a few places ahead of Elijah fumbled through his jacket, searching for his boarding pass, his hands trembling slightly. Boots. The gate agent didn't rush him. Take your time, sir, she said. No impatience, no suspicion, just respect. The man found his pass and exhaled with relief. Boots. Thank you. You're very welcome. It lasted only a few seconds. Most people in that line probably forgot it before they'd even reached their seats. Boots. Elijah did not. Dignity, he had learned, usually lives inside moments that small. Once the plane leveled off above the clouds, his phone buzzed once. Boots. A message from Gerald Whitfield. The Independent Culture Report had just been released publicly. Customer trust scores were up. Employee confidence scores were up. Boots. Complaints involving unfair treatment had dropped by more than 58% industry-wide since Coastal Vista published its findings, and its penalties for the world to see. Boots. At the bottom of the report was a single sentence Renata Cole had insisted stay in, word for word, no matter how many executives wanted it softened. Boots. Culture changes when people decide that respect is no longer optional. Elijah locked his phone and looked out at the clouds, stretching endlessly beneath the wing. Boots. He thought about his father's watch on his wrist, about a mechanic who never once got to sit up front. Boots. About a manager who never said she was sorry until she had lost absolutely everything, and finally, painfully did. About a woman in cream cashmere who did say it, far sooner, and rebuilt something quieter and better than what she had broken. Boots. About a mother 2 rows back who once lowered her hand instead of raising it, and who he would never meet, and who was, statistically, sitting on some other flight somewhere over America at this exact moment, deciding whether to raise it this time. Boots. He thought, too, about something Renata Cole had said to him on the phone the week the settlement was finalized, almost in passing, the way people say the truest things. Not as a headline, just as an afterthought before hanging up. Boots. The scary part was never Deborah, she'd said. The scary part was how ordinary the reasons were. Nobody in that building thought of themselves as the villain of anything. Boots. They just kept choosing the easy answer instead of the honest one voucher at a time. For 6 years, until the easy answer had a body count nobody could see. Boots. Elijah hadn't had a response for that then. He still didn't, exactly. He just knew it was true, and that knowing it was true was its own kind of responsibility now. Boots. Sometimes the strongest person in the room isn't the one holding the most power. It's the one who refuses to let a personal injustice curdle into hatred, and turns it instead into something that protects the next person walking down that aisle. Boots. That kind of decision doesn't make headlines for long, but it outlasts every single one of them. Boots. If this story reached something in you, not because of how it ended, but because you recognize someone in it, maybe even yourself, in one of those quiet seats where nobody said a word, then let it matter for a minute longer than the scroll usually allows. Boots. Like it if it moved you. Share it, if you know someone who needs to hear that they are not invisible. Boots. And tell me in the comments, have you ever been in that cabin? And if you have, which seat were you in? I read every single answer.